Good evening. It is now a few minutes after 4. I would like to call the Rockdale County Board of Education workshop to order. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
So moved.
Second, Akita.
Have a motion and second to approve the agenda. All in favor, raise your hands, please. Motion carries unanimously. Dr. Oates, would you please introduce the presenter?
Thank you very much. I am happy to introduce to our board, as well as our executive cabinet and those of our community members, Mr. Tim Cochran, who's currently the executive director of Pioneer RESA. Previously, Tim served as a superintendent in Decatur County Schools, of course, was the most recent tenure. And prior to that, I believe you were in Atkinson County as well as superintendent, total of 12 years served. He is going to be presenting on House Bill 581. And in the course of his presentation, he'll share more about his background in that regard. Thank you, Tim.
Before I get into my spiel, I'm gonna pass this around for y'all to sign because I am a certified board trainer. So y'all can not only have to listen to me, you can get credit for board hours. So I'm gonna pass this. You guys get your hours because I know sometimes that's aggravating. And I guess the beauty of it is, if those of y'all have been on the board for a while, this will at least be a topic you haven't heard in a board training, because sometimes they get repeated a little bit. So in any case, appreciate y'all having me. Like Dr. Oates said, I'm Tim Cochran. I was prior to last year, I was superintendent. I was superintendent for 12 years, elementary and high school principal before that, economics teacher and coach before that. So always wanted to get to the mountains. And so last year I had an opportunity to get to the mountains and become the director of Pioneer RESA. And so that's how I got to that place. How I got 581, I kind of got stuck into that. I'm not sure really. Glutton for punishment, I think. I don't know if you guys use PKKN, Corey, formerly Harbin and Hartley, Corey Kirby, attorney with them. Y'all know they represent a lot of schools. And Corey called me in the summer and said, "Hey, can you dig into this 581 and figure out the finance piece of it?" And so that's how I started digging into that. And then Corey wanted me to start presenting and helping out to educate boards. And so I think as of the Christmas break, I will have covered, I was telling one of your directors, I think I will have covered about 90 counties outside of Pioneer RESA. A lot of times in groups. I've not done them all individually because we've done some RESAs where I've gone and done a whole group. So it has been a gauntlet trying to educate everybody on 581. So basically 581 was passed it was a bill that got passed this legislative cycle, and it had to go before the borders, and it was go before the voters, and it was on the ballot this past couple weeks ago, first week of November, and it passed 67% statewide. So what that means is it now becomes a constitutional amendment. It becomes law as of January 1. What does 581 say? Basically, 581 caps the amount that homesteaded property can increase in any given assessment. Y'all know they come through every few years and reassess your properties in your communities. And this bill puts a cap on how much that reassessment can increase. It only applies to homesteaded properties. And what I mean by homestead, we have a state homestead exemption. You go down to your courthouse, your tax office, and you file the thing saying this is my primary residence, and you get a $2,000 exemption off your property value for your dwelling and up to 5 to 10 acres around it. It's not all the property you own. It's not businesses. It's not farmland. It's only your dwelling that qualifies for the homestead. That's the only property that 581 applies to. So y'all know after COVID, we've seen unreal inflation in our country and in our state and in our communities. And a lot of communities were going through reassessments, and they were having, 20, 30% increases in property value. Well, in the attempt to help fix that, 581 was born. And let me very much preface what I'm saying tonight. I'm going to go through what 581 is, a little bit about the finances, and then about your options, because you have an opportunity to opt out of 581 if you choose to. By no means am I trying to tell you what to do. So I don't ever want y'all to think I'm here telling you how to react to 581. That is not my place. I'll be glad to give you my pros and cons opinions, because I could make both of them. But don't for any reason think I'm telling you guys what to do, because every community's got to make this decision, and it's going to impact every community differently. Okay, Rockdale's no different than all the other communities as far as that goes. Y'all will have a different impact. So with 581, it applies to cities, counties, and school boards. All three of y'all levy taxes. Y'all are a taxing authority, and so 581 impacts all three of y'all. Independently, all three of y'all can choose to opt out of 581. Meaning it wouldn't apply. And you guys do not have to file suit with the county or the city. The city can opt out, the schools can stay in, or vice versa. But all three agencies have the opportunity to opt out of 581. If you choose to opt out, you can't start the process before January 1, and you have to complete the entire process before March 1 and file a resolution with the Secretary of State. I will email, well, you already have this presentation, Dr. Oates, so you can share this, and all the information I'm sharing will be in here. There is no sunset provision on 581. It is the law of the land technically until they change the law. If you are in 581 as of March 1st, you are in forever. If you opt out of 581, you are out forever. All right, so that's, you have a very short window to discuss. You have a very short window and short runway if you choose to opt out. But no matter what you decide, March 1st is the deadline, and you are in or out. You guys may remember back in the 80s, the districts were allowed to opt out of Social Security. Are you guys a Social Security district? Did y'all opted out of that? Well, back in the 80s, that was a big decision and a big brouhaha for a lot of districts. So, you know, the ones that chose to opt out, if y'all were, none of y'all look old enough to be dealing with that in the 80s. So I know none of y'all were around during then. But back then, there was a lot of controversy, and people like, if y'all opt out, you know, people are going to be homeless because they're not going to have Social Security to depend on. And now I would argue, Dr. Oates may have a different opinion. You guys have a different opinion. It's really easy to recruit younger people without Social Security, because you can pay them a little bit more and or do a match into a 401, 403B, or 457. So I know my last district was not a Social Security district, and I thought that was great because I'm not counting on it. I wanted my home money to invest. And so, but back in the 80s, that was a big deal. You had one chance, and you were either in or out. 581 is a similar decision. In the 1990s, there was an opportunity to pass 1% local option sales tax for schools. There was about a dozen districts in the state that chose to pass that 1 cent lost that would go for maintenance and operation. Not the East Lost. We can all pass those, but this was one that could go forever. About a dozen districts in the state did that then. And now a lot of us wish we had that. So that's another example of kind of the decision that you'll have to make with 581. There is a lot of unknowns on this bill, and everything I share with you tonight is the best knowledge we have as of today. And when I say we, I'm referring to myself and Corey Kirby from PKKN, because he's the other individual that we've been working with on this. And we've done presentations together on this as well. So if you hear me refer to counsel, I'm referring to that law firm. I know you guys may use different firms, so you may want to get opinion from your people, and that's normal. So I will point out several discrepancies as I go through this about things that are our best guess, because there's a lot of guessing involved with some of this. So to recap, basically the bill caps your property value. Let me walk back through that. You have a $100,000 home, and they come in and reassess your home, and they say your home has gone from $100,000 to $150,000. That's a 50% increase. So under the old way, your home value would go up to 150, and you'd pay tax on 40% of that. Under 581, it couldn't go to 50% unless inflation was 50%. If inflation was at 2% the previous year, then the most that home could go up was $102,000. And then the next reassessment, it can only go up by whatever inflation. Does not impact the value of your home. You on your home, the more of an impact that would have for the school board, the city and the county, whoever's levying a mill. Because what it would do is over time, it's just going to slowly suppress that part of your digest. Okay. And again, it's only on homesteaded property. It does not impact business, corporate, large farms, rentals, things of that nature. Now, if the home sells, say you own your home, you buy your home for $100,000, you live in it for 25 years, and now the tax value is 150,000, but you could sell it for $500,000. When you sell, then whatever you sell it for becomes the new base. And then 581 kicks in again. So if you sell it or if you transfer the deed, you try to give it to your children, it will readjust to whatever market value is, and then the cap will reapply moving forward. Whatever the property value is in Rockdale County right now in 2024 is where the base will begin. So in 2025, if there's a reassessment done, whatever the value is this year on that property is the base. And it could only go up by inflation after that. Okay? Questions thus far? Y'all stop me at any time. Yeah, yes. You're
I
good. I can-
apologize. I understand if you gift it to your children, it adjusts right then. What about if your children inherit it upon death?
Anytime there's a deed change, if there's a deed change, it will reassess. It will go to the market value. Yep.
So conceivably, if you had like a big farmer, a house that had a lot of.
Keep in mind, it
appreciation.
won't impact the farms and the large properties. Because even if you have 200 acres, all of that wouldn't qualify for homestead. It's only the dwelling, and it's either 5 or 10 acres. It's somewhere in that range. So it would not apply to all of the property because the homestead exemption doesn't apply to all of that property.
And I would just as a reminder to our board, if you pose a question, make sure your mic is turned on because we're live streaming this public board workshop meeting.
All right, let's look at some figures. This is a spreadsheet that I created to try to help superintendents and boards figure out what impact you may have. I'm gonna show you a couple examples. So I know it doesn't look like much right now. There's no way of projecting what next year is going to look like on your tax roll. There's no way of knowing what your tax digest is going to look like 5 years from now. The only way is to go backwards and look back in time as to what had happened in the past. We have no way of knowing if we're going to have another pandemic, if we're going to have a recession, if we're going to have inflation. So no way of knowing what the future holds, but we can look at the past. And so we created this spreadsheet to give boards and the best idea of what impact this would have had 581 been in place. Basically what you do, all you have to do is fill in the yellow columns. The first column is the 40% tax value of just your homesteaded property. So not your entire digest, not your net digest, just the 40% value of homesteaded properties in your community. The school district does not have this information. Your CFOs don't have this. It's not on any documents, and it's not anything I can find on the Department of Revenue. You have to get that from your local tax assessor. They can pull that, and I will tell you some communities, they've struggled to pull that. I'm sure Rockdale has a larger tax office, probably has more than 1 to 2 people working in it. However, some communities, you know, they got new people in the office and they've struggled. So if you struggle, if you have it, that's normal because they're not used to pulling this either. But you pull that. Dr. Oates has a copy of this, so I'm sure they're working on it if they've not already completed it to give you guys an idea. The second yellow column is your millage rate for that tax year, okay? If you put those 2 bits of information in, everything else will self-populate. What it will do is it will look at the growth of that homesteaded property from year to year. And if the growth was more than inflation, it will automatically in this chart reduce it back to what it would have been because you couldn't go above inflation. And I'll show you some examples. Now, the first thing I want to point out, I talked about the best we know. There's a lot of educated guesses in some of this. In that chart, you'll see 5th column to the right, from the left to the right. You can see where it says CPI for previous year. Everybody see that? That is the Consumer Price Index. The bill says the state tax commissioner will determine the rate of inflation. They say in the bill that it is the state tax commissioner's authority to pick an index that can be used. The Consumer Price Index was actually mentioned in the bill as a type of index that can be used. Doesn't mean it's going to be the index. I would argue the CPI is probably not the best reflection of Georgia, because Georgia grows a little faster than the nation, and the CPI is a national inflationary score. The CPI also doesn't include real estate. The CPI is a bunch of groceries that they compare. However, it is considered an inflationary index, and I use that because it was specifically listed in the law as one that could be used. But I say that to say the state tax commissioner will determine what that is, and they've not picked that yet. So this is an example of us doing our best guess. They can pick anything they deem. I thought I'd found Georgia's inflationary rate. I was really excited. I put it in the chart. I started doing some numbers, looking, comparison and crunching, and I realized it was the country of Georgia's inflation that I found, not the state of Georgia's. So, there's not a lot of good indexes out there. And quite honestly, there's none that are going to be representative of Rockdale County and Atkinson County, or Union County and Decatur County, because Georgia's so diverse and so large. But there was talk about having having indexes for regions or counties. When I say there was talk, that is not in the language of the law. So if you talk to your local authorities, if you talk to your legislators, you will hear a lot of different opinions. And I would caution you that they're all just that, opinions, because the law, this bill got changed multiple times before it passed. And so you'll have legislators that say, you guys, can pass a penny sales tax if you stay in. That is not accurate. If the county and the city stays in and doesn't opt out, they have an option to pass a 1 cent local option sales tax. The schools do not have that option. I think it was in one of the earlier versions of the bill, but the bill changed multiple times before it passed. So with that being said, let's look at a couple examples. I have a couple examples on here. These are actual school districts in the state of Georgia. These are two districts that I was able to access the data, talk with the tax office. I knew I could get as good a data as we could get, and there's no perfect in this. This particular example is a city school district in the metro area, has about 10,000 kids. So this is a little bit more reflective of what you guys may experience than the second example. But you can see, and you can look, there's a lot of numbers on the chart. The first thing I want to point out to you, you'll see the first percentage graph that says percentage over previous year. Anytime I'm talking about something, y'all stop me if you don't see it. I have a tendency to turn around and point, but I know it's being recorded, so I want to make sure we stay on the microphone. But the column that says percentage over previous year, that's where it's comparing one year from the next. And you can see, if you look at year 2023, this particular community obviously had a reassessment. Their homestead values went up 23%. Well, that year they couldn't have if 581 had been in place. The inflationary index was at 8% the previous year. So the most they could have gone up was 8%. So you go all the way over to the far right, you can see of negative 1.6 million. That's the amount of revenue less that they would have collected under the millage that they levied. They levied 6.195. Now, when you see 6.1, you automatically think, wow, that's super low. It's a city district and they levy 100% of the value. So you guys are levying on 40% of the value, they're levying on 100. City school districts do that. So that's pretty normal. So their millage would be roughly 15 mils if they were levying a full 40% value like you guys do. So just want to throw that out there because everybody looks at 6 mils and go, Lord of mercy, but a little different the way they do their taxes. So as a board, you can see over the last 6 years, they would have collected 4.8 million less than they collected under the millage that they levied. So as a board, they have to make the decision. Could we have handled that? Could we have adjusted? I would argue that most boards in the last couple of years probably could. We had a lot of federal money come in with COVID. It allowed us to shore up our reserves in a lot of districts, which is a good thing. Even though some people may try to make us sound like that's a bad thing, it's not a bad thing to have a rainy day fund. But the question is what does this look like over 20 years, 30 years? This is a decision like building a school. When you build a school, you build a school for 50 years. You know you're going to be in that. You have to be in the building for 40 before you can phase it out. So when you build a building, you know it's a 50-year decision. This decision's not going to impact probably y'all's tenure. It's probably not going to impact Dr. Oates' tenure. Probably not going to impact the next superintendent's tenure. 3 or 4 soups down the line, 10, 15, and that time's going to be different for the community because the faster you're growing, the quicker it's going to catch you, if it catches you, and it may not catch some districts, but you can see the reduction. Now, you have to figure that out as a board. You have to figure out, can we handle that? Because you know, they can cut taxes. There is no tax cut without a revenue cut. And you have a school to operate, and your budget is what your budget is. So somebody's got to balance the budget, whether you're balancing it through a slightly increased millage, whether you're balancing it from cutting something. Your budget is 85 to 90% people, like every other school district in the state. So when you start trimming, it's hard to trim a lot out of a budget that's 90% people without cutting some people. I would argue, I would argue that probably every one of you probably have family members or know somebody, really close friend, that works for the school system. Most school districts are the largest employer in the communities in the state of Georgia. So when you start talking about trimming, that's how you trim. You know, there's no other way around it. So that's the trick. You have to pull your numbers. You have to look and decide, can we manage this, or do we want to take the avenue to opt out? Another example, and then I'll make sure I stop and take questions if you guys have questions. This is a rural district in Georgia. This is in South Georgia. I may or may not have been the superintendent of this district. May or may not have. They actually don't care that I say that. So, but so I do know these numbers are really accurate because it was my old district. But you can see what would have impacted there. They would have only impacted 3 of the 6 years on this chart. What would be really interesting is to take this chart and go all the way back to the recession. There's no way I can access those numbers to do that. The only way you could do that is get the tax assessor to pull that all the way back. And it's been difficult for some of the assessors to pull just through 18 for some districts. But remember, 581 only caps how quickly it can rise. Think about back during the recession, and Rockdale may have experienced a totally different recession than I did. Probably did actually, but some communities, a lot of communities had property values go down during the recession. So if that happened, think about, had the cap been in place, how long would it have taken them to go up if they could only go by the rate of inflation? So, you know, that was a housing bubble market. It was not necessarily an inflationary market, kind of like we have now. So interesting times. This is a really good snapshot of an inflationary time. But if you could go back and look during the recession of, you know, 08, 9, 10, 11, it would be interesting to see, because if you had drastic reductions in your property values and you had a cap, it'd be interesting to see how much money, you know, you would have lost over that time. Again, in this district, you know, they could, I know for a fact we could have handled that over 6 years. We could have balanced that. But what does it look like 10, 20, 30 years? You know, that's a decision they'll have to make. I'm going to stop there. Questions so far about money, about projections? I want to also point out too, I talked about a guess, a best guess on this chart. I'm going to go back to the previous. If you look at this district, I want you to think about, this is assuming a reassessment every year. I don't know how Rockdale does it. I'm assuming a large district like Rockdale, they probably reassess areas, you know, and then every so often. When's the last full reassessment you guys have had? Do you know? Anybody know? Don't know. And that's okay, because every community is different. I know communities that I've been working with in the last 2 months that haven't had a full reassessment in 15 to 20 years. I know several communities that just went through a reassessment this year for the first time in over 15. One was at 15, one was at 17, one was at 20. I know one that's at 17 right now and not planning to do a reassessment until 27. So they're in a mess. But all of those communities were in a mess because you just think about how much your property value's gone up in the last 15 years. And so the board is in a tizzy, because the communities, or excuse me, the communities in a tizzy because their property values have skyrocketed because they haven't been reassessed. The statute says they're supposed to be reassessed once every 5 years. Under 581, this new bill says the reassessment has to reoccur every 3 years. All right, this chart is assuming a full reassessment every year so that you could maximize the potential growth. That's not realistic. I would argue no district's going to have a full reassessment every year. And if there's any community member, if you know of your tax people can tell you different, please pass that along, because especially in a community like Rockdale, they probably do zones so that every so often they can hit the whole county. But this is best case. So keep that in mind when you fill your chart out. If you look at that, this probably isn't. That number's probably makes you feel a little better. It's probably going to be a little worse, actually, because you're not going to realize that growth. That makes sense. I know this is a lot. I'm throwing a lot. It's like drinking through a water hose. So feel free. Like I said, you stop me. Yes, sir.
So if there's a reassessment at 3 years, but obviously the inflation indexes, they come out every single year.
Hey,
So
Justin, is your mic on?
it is.
Okay, great, great.
The inflationary indexes, they are released every year.
Mhm.
So if you have a reassessment at 3 years, but you have a yearly inflationary index, is that the increase in that inflationary index cumulative over that 3 years before the reassessment?
That's a good question. That is definitely a way that the tax commissioner could potentially look at it. But the law just says during a reassessment, it can't go up more than the rate inflation from the previous year. So it doesn't say there's any rolling average. But again, the state tax commissioner has some authority over that. But the law just says from the previous year. So if you take it at the letter of the law, it makes it sound like they do a reassessment, whatever inflation was last year is the most you can go up.
I see. Thank you.
But again, there's a lot of unknowns. That's the trick with this bill. Any other questions?
Going to discuss the pros and the cons, and so that's what I'm waiting for, just to hear what other
Okay.
pros and cons of opting out of the bill, staying within the bill. That's what I'm waiting for.
Okay, well, I'll talk about that now before I get into the process of opting out, because I'm on that's after these charts. So what are the pros of staying in? Well, the pros of staying in is it's going to reduce the tax burden for all your homeowners that have homestead. It will, and the longer they're in that home, the more it's going to suppress their tax bill, because it's going to reduce their growth. Because y'all all know the market grows faster than inflation, and especially in this area. This area of the state has grown and seen a lot of growth. So this bill passed the ballot at 67%. I would argue most people don't understand it because they don't put the language on any of the constitutional amendments. They don't explain them. There was definitely not this depth of an explanation on that. So a lot of people, they'll vote on things and not really know the ins and outs of it. But it did pass 67%. So that's an argument. A lot of people, say, well, if we need to raise the millage, then we'll raise the millage and realize that on everybody else, on the business owners and the large landowners. That may or may not fly in a lot of communities. I mean, like I said, every community is totally different. The biggest advantage is that break to the taxpayer. The disadvantage is how's it going to impact y'all? And that's a big how, because I'm showing you potential, but there's a lot of things that we don't even know. So we don't know what it's going to look like next year. We don't know what it's going to look like 20 years from now. What if they go in this legislative session and change something and you're in? And that's not to say that couldn't happen. So that is definitely a disadvantage for staying in. That's probably the biggest two right there. You're giving your taxpayers, because here's the thing, the public, I mean, let's face it, if I ask anybody in this room to figure their tax bill, how many could probably do it? I would argue not a lot, because that's not something a lot of people are taught, and it's pretty convoluted. Your state homestead exemption. Anybody know how much that saves you in Rockdale County? How much? State exemption, the state homestead is $2,000.
That's correct.
And that 2,000 is $2,000 off the value of your home. The millage is collected per 1,000 of assessed value. So what is your millage here? 20? So the homestead exemption in Rockdale County would save, and school taxes will save, the average person will save everybody $40 because it's $2,000. It's 2 meals. It's 20 meals per 1,000. So that's what the homestead saves you. And so whatever the county or city tax is, you would add that meal, multiply that by 2. But the school millage, it would save you $40. A lot of people don't know that because they see the $2,000, but I just say that to say that that's a convoluted process. This is going to be the same way. It's not going to be very easily to explain. And at the end of the day, like I said, it's going to be money in this hand, rolling around here, out this hand, because unless you cut your budget, if your revenues go down, you got to balance it somehow. So if you have to bump the millage, or maybe you don't have to bump the millage up, but you can't roll it back as far as you could have. And the ones that don't have the exemption will be paying the full amount. So it's only the homesteader property. So there again, you think about that. You could have a house in a neighborhood be paying the full amount because they didn't go get their homestead exemption, and a house right next door, maybe they've owned it for 20 years under the homestead, and one could be paying tax on $400,000 value and one could be paying tax on $200,000 value, and they're both the same house. So those are all some of the issues with the bill that could come up. Questions? Any other? Let's talk about the process if you choose to opt out. Because honestly, if you don't want to opt out, you don't have to do anything else. You're good. You're in. You're in as of right now, unless you choose to do something else. This is question. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that you give us pros and cons. I got reduced tax burden.
Reduced tax burden is your pro for the tax. Your con is your reduced revenue and the unknowns. That's the con for staying in, because you know you're going. It's going for a community like Rockdale that's growing. It will reduce. It will suppress that digest, and so it's just going to be a matter of does it suppress it to the point where you can't roll back millage, or even one day has to bump the millage back up. That's your con. So, if you choose the opt out, you must adopt a resolution by March 1st. You have to have 3 public hearings, very similar to just like when you do millage hearings. You have advertised your hearings in the newspaper and on the website. There is mandated language and there's mandated size. You have to issue a press release at the same time that you have a notice, and then you have to file all of this with the Secretary of State. All of this has to be done by March 1st. The 3 meetings that you have to have will sound very familiar to your millage hearings if you've ever had to have those. 1 meeting has to occur between the hours of 6 and 7. Now, it doesn't have to be completed. It just has to start between the hours of 6 and 7. All your meetings have to transpire on a business workday, business weekday. Can't have it on a holiday. Keep in mind, January 1st is a holiday, Martin Luther King is a holiday, and President's Day is a holiday. So there's 3 holidays you lose, and February is the shortest month of the year. So if you choose to opt out, you have a short window and you have a short runway. So you got to be prepared and hit the ground running in January. You have to publish the intent to opt out. I'll show you the language on that. You have to advertise it in your newspaper of general circulation and on your website. Now, y'all's newspaper here, does it come out weekly? Does it come out multiple days a week? Thank you so much. Why? Okay, so you got 2. Well, that's better than most communities, because most communities, most smaller, not necessarily metro, but most smaller communities, they have a once a week paper. So that's something to consider. Keep in mind, and I'll say it in the next one. So that gives you a little bit more, because if the paper messes up the ad, you got to start over. All right. And so that's something to keep in mind, because that does happen. It has happened. And if you get challenged and you didn't follow the law and you mess something up, you don't have any time to start this over, because it's got to be done by March 1st. A lot of mandates come from Atlanta, say that you have to advertise something on a prominent location on the website. This one doesn't say prominent. Nobody's ever defined what prominent means, but by all intents and purposes, I'd slap it on the front page of your website. Don't try to hide it. You're going to take your lumps. If you choose to opt out, you might as well take it and roll with it. So just put it on the front of the website, although it doesn't say it has to be in a prominent location on this one. That is the exact language of the notice. That is in the law, word for word. You don't need to change a T, an I, a period, a space. It needs to be just like this because this is exactly how it's in the law. The only thing you should do is put your information in the parentheticals. Now, I want you to look at that real quick and see if the wording may cause problems when you run that into the paper. If you see anything in the wording that stands out to you. And I'll give you a hint, you don't have to go past the title. Intent to opt out of homestead exemption. That's going to make your people in your community think you're exempting all homestead. And that is absolutely not what this is doing. But that is absolutely, y'all been on the board, that is exactly the way it's going to be interpreted. You may have, do y'all have any other local exemptions in Rockdale? What all do y'all have here? So you have a statewide, so y'all have a local senior exemption, okay? You have a statewide homestead, you have a statewide senior low income, and you have a statewide veteran, disabled veteran. So y'all have a local senior as well. So you advertise this, people are immediately going to think you're trying to get rid of all of that. So the notification and the education of what this actually is, it's going to be tough, especially with a short window. However, that's what you have to add. You have to run that. There's no reasoning in there about why you want to opt out. You can at the bottom of that notice, if you would like to put the reasoning on there, that is totally your decision. You can talk to your counsel and see what they recommend. I know a lot of people I talk to say don't put a reason. If people want to know the reason, that's why you're having the hearings. Now, you do have to do a press release. That's where you could put some reasoning. The council I've worked with recommends to use this notice as your press release and then any information behind it that you want the public to know. You need to run the notice and the advertisement. You have to run it 1 week prior to each meeting. When you do millage, you can actually have 2 meetings in 1 day. There's nothing in 581 that says you can't have 2 meetings in 1 day. PKKN is recommending to people not to do that for the simple fact they want to make it very as clean as it can be to not give somebody a chance to challenge you. And so when it says the language of the law says you have to run the advertisement at least 1 week prior to each meeting, somebody could argue that if you did it 2 in 1 day, but again, you can consult with your own counsel. The law does not say you can't have 2 meetings in a day, but PKKN is advising to do 3 individual meetings. Now, if I'm superintendent and my board wants to opt out, what I would recommend is the first week in January, hit the ground rolling with as soon as you can get in the paper in that first week, go ahead and advertise all 3 dates. Set your 3 dates, go ahead and advertise all of them that first week in January, put them in the ad, make sure you wait 7 days. When you do millage hearings, the Department of Revenue allows you to have your hearing on the 7th day it's run. This is not administered by the Department of Revenue. So to be safe, have your meeting on the 8th day. So make sure it runs 7 full days and then meet on the 8th. Then run it again before your next meeting with the next 2 dates, then run it again with the last date. But if you get that first one run 7 days before your first meeting and all the dates are on there, that should cover you if in case the paper makes a mistake on any of the requirements. Of course, the requirements are 30 square inches. That has to be 30 square inches, and it can't run the legal notice. This year, PKKN represented 3 districts that had challenges on their millage. One district, the paper shrunk the ad to less than 30 square inches. The editor of the paper admitted that the board requested 30 square inches, but they decided to shrink it so that they could run an ad next to it about the superintendent getting a raise. They had to redo all of their hearings because the ad was not 30 square inches. The other 2 districts, it ran in the legal notices. Even the paper admitted that the Board of Education sent them the right documentation and requested it, but they chose to put in the legal notices. Those 2 districts had to redo their hearings again. The reason I say that is you don't have time to redo these. So if they mess up and you can't get completed by March 1st, you're stuck. So if you choose to opt out, Make sure it's 30 square inches, take your ruler, because believe it or not, you guys may never get these challenges, but there are groups that not even in your community, not even in the state that will challenge things like this. And if they'll challenge a regular millage hearing, they're dang sure going to challenge this if you opt out. So make sure you just got all your P's and Q's in order so that there's no opportunity for somebody to overturn it if you choose, because if you choose to opt out, you've gone through a lot of trouble. And it'd be really bad to lose on a challenge because your ad was 25 square inches instead of 30. And that is exactly what the law states. Okay. Questions on that? This is not the resolution. This is just a copy of a resolution, but you have to pass a resolution. The law says you can pass the resolution at any time prior to March 1st, after January 1st, prior to March 1st. It doesn't make a lot of sense to pass it before you have your 3 hearings. So if you do your resolution, I know PKKN has drafted one. Your general counsel could draft one as well. The one that PKKN will provide basically lays out the statute of the law, whereas the Rockdale County Board of Education chooses to opt out of House Bill 581 and has had 3 public hearings on this date, this date, and this date, blah, blah, blah. It's advertised it, and then you'll have exhibits where you put all your documentation with that. So that's something that can be done. And then you have to file with the Secretary of State. Normally, everything's filed with the Secretary of State's office online. As of today, we have no idea. There's nothing online about filing this resolution. We've made jokes about it. And of course, Secretary of State's office has been a little busy. We just had a national election in November, so they weren't returning phone calls. We are hopeful that we'll have guidance by January 1 of how to file resolutions. But in the meantime, the recommendation is if you do pass your resolution, also allow the superintendent to hand deliver this to the Secretary of State's office. Fax it so that you have a timestamp, and on a fax it says received. Email it, because you can print that and show that you emailed it prior to March 1st, and have Dr. Oates hand deliver it and video himself walking it in. Again, I know that sounds silly, but we are hopeful by January 1, at least by March 1st, that there's guidance on how to do that. And I do feel like there will be. But again, you got to make sure you can document that you did everything you need to do so that if you get a challenge, questions?
Tim, John Zahner, who's the executive director for the Georgia School Superintendents Association, shared information with superintendents recently in which he talked about recently learning about how local 5 mil share will be reconciled with HB 581. If you can address that.
Yep, let me talk about that, and I'll share with you some survey results too. So you guys are aware. In your allotment sheets, the state calculates what you earn through the QBE process. And before they send you any money, they back out 5 mils of your local taxes. The 5 mil local fair share that comes off the top of what you earn. And the old statute from 1985, the process of that is because the state wanted to make sure everybody had some skin in the game and everybody levied at least 5 mils. That was the logic behind that. Now, when they calculate local fair share, before they do that, they will back out state exemptions. So that state homestead exemption, that state senior exemption, and that state veterans exemption, it will come off your digest before they apply local fair share. Basically not to penalize you, because you're not collecting taxes on that. Your local exemptions, if you pass the local senior exemption, it does not come off. So you get penalized, believe it or not, on your local fair share for any local exemptions. You're not levying taxes on that seniors, but yet it's their values are being applied to local fair share. We were working on how this would impact local fair share. It made sense to me that it should be a state exemption since it is a state constitutional amendment. And I found out 2 weeks ago, maybe 2.5 now, this will be counted as a local exemption, which means it will count towards your local fair share. So you're not going to collect taxes on it, but it will back off your local fair share. Now, it's not going to increase your local fair share. It's just not going to decrease it. And in my mind, it should have decreased it because you're not going to be able to collect taxes on this. And this was a state constitutional amendment. But for whatever reason, they're going to count it as a local since you guys have the opportunity to opt out. So it will not back off the local fair share. And in some communities, you know, it could that could help offset any reduced revenue. So that was kind of a big deal. It doesn't change. Like I said, I've had people calling me about how that will impact and recalculate local fair share. It won't change that calculation. Whatever your digest is currently is what your local fair share is going to be. It's just not going to back it down like it probably should. We sent out surveys, we got results a couple weeks ago. You probably got that from John Zonner as well. We asked districts, which way are you leaning? Are you leaning to opt out? You leaning to stay in? Or you're undecided? Because that's some superintendents had asked and felt like that would be relative. Of 180 districts, we had just over 100, I think 103, 105 respond back. Roughly 70% of those districts are planning to opt out as of a week and a half, 2 weeks ago when that survey came back. I have no idea of knowing where those 100 districts are. They could be in metro, they can be in rural. I do know individual districts that are telling me, but again, don't know exactly where the makeup is. Of the 70%, again, 70% are planning to opt out. Another 12 to 13% are planning to stay in, and the other percentage, 13-ish%, are undecided. So that was the results of that survey for what that's worth. A lot of people want to know that because sometimes it's better to be in the big school of fish rather than the little fish swimming outside of the school of fish. So kind of like when we cancel school for weather and everything else, we tend to follow our neighbors sometimes. So I guess that's why everybody wanted to see that. I am a little surprised. I really thought when I started doing these trainings and going through this, it would not be that high. I really felt the political ramifications would be too convoluted and too difficult for a lot of boards to want to navigate. But as we've gone through it, as we looked at the money, as we looked at the unknowns, a lot of boards are saying, you know what, we don't need Atlanta to tell us what to do. Y'all have already passed the senior exemption. So you've already taken action. You've lowered your millage, 5 mills in 7 years. So you could argue that you guys are representing your districts well. You've rolled that back. You've given a senior exemption. Again, that's just different arguments that communities are using. It's not necessarily a right or wrong, but that is some of the arguments. You could pass your own local homestead. Hall County, good example. Their local delegate passed a 3% cap this year. So no matter what they do with 581, they have a local 3% cap. Their reassessment homestead values can never rise more than 3% in a reassessment. So they're opting out or plan to opt out because they already have a local one. They don't need it. And so that's something that some districts are using as reasons too. Again, very different. Everybody has a slightly different opinion on where they think they need to be. When is y'all have an E-SPLOST currently?
Mhm.
When is it renewed?
It was just passed this past spring,
Good.
E+6.
Good, because that's at the table for some boards. I was with a board last night that their E-SPLOST renews in March. So they've got to go through this process, January through March, potentially get everybody riled up and then ask them to pass the E-SPLOST. So as of last night, that board's like, I really don't like the unknowns. Now, granted, that board was very small and they probably are not going to see the same financial impact you guys may see because they're not growing like you guys. However, the board didn't really like all the unknowns, but then they also didn't know if they wanted to go through this process, turn right around and pass a SPLOST. So you got a lot of that going on too. Every district, like I said, it's in a little different place with this.
Tim, let me just share this and also keep in mind we have a viewing public. So I may be saying things that you may know on the dais or here, but just our regular order would be that as superintendent, I would make a recommendation to the board, right? And so but where we are is that we're in the education phase, right? We've got to make sure that this board has all the information and then some that it needs to make a decision. And I don't want to bring even a recommendation publicly if in fact there's not majority support for whatever we, and obviously
Absolutely.
The default it would be, right. So we're in unless we're out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you only take action to opt out.
That's correct.
You don't have to do anything to stay in.
That's right.
So this is why you're here. This is why the tax assessor 3 weeks ago was in this very room sharing with our board as part of our board institute what HB 581 is and what the implications are. And one of the things that I have shared with the board is that we have to remember the headwinds that we already are facing that has reduced our revenue, right? In terms of the employer contributions to TRS, increased costs for certified and classified health insurance. The whole piece, of course, Senate Bill 233. We're focused on 581 now, but there was the voucher bill that should be kicking in that will divert funds from the public school system. If in our case, and we're not unique, we've seen a steady decrease in our equalization funding. So all of that is the context that our board and our governance team has to be aware of that we're operating in. And then the vortex of 581 comes in. So again, I respect any decision that an individual board would take on 581, but collectively, we've got to know where ultimately our board stands, because there is a short window if opting out is a legitimate option. Because if you're staying in, then you don't have to worry about anything, because you don't have to do anything.
That's correct.
So I just want, if you had any thoughts about that,
Yeah, and you're exactly right. This is the process that you take. You get educated, you discuss it, you let your superintendent know which way you're leaning, what you think they need to do. You have another work session, planning sessions, retreats, whatever you want to call them. And that's the process of the board. You don't have to meet and take a vote. There's a lot you guys have to do on a normal day just to discuss. And this is an example of that. That's what board training is about, for you to learn and discuss. And so you absolutely, that's the route you should take. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's what boards are in the process of doing now. And between now and January 1, you need to do it as much as you need to till you have a solid, firm majority that you believe this is the direction we need to take. And then, of course, naturally, majority rules. You roll with that. And but you definitely don't take a vote unless you're passing the resolution. And don't go through the hearing and do all of that. You find out. Discuss it. You guys discuss all kind of stuff all the time. That's your role. You discuss it, you think about it, and you let him know. And when he knows there's I got a majority that wants to do this, then y'all move. You move on it, but you don't vote on anything except the resolution. And that resolution is the vote that opts you out. But you're exactly right. That is the normal process that every board will go under. And it's going to be, like I said, I hate to say it, it's different in every community. It's going to be different on every board. You have different lenses. All of you come with a different lens, and that's the beauty of what we do. You have a different lens to represent a different part of this community, and you respect the democratic process, majority rules, and you roll with it. You know, that y'all been doing a long time, I'm assuming. I don't know if we have any new board members here, but you know, that's the normal process with everything. And you know, I think the more communication you have, the better, especially for these things. This is, like I said earlier, this is like building a school building. You talk a lot when you build a building. It takes you 18 months, 2 years, sometimes longer than that, to get a building design, finance, ready to go. It's at least a 2-year process. So you're talking planning for 2 years. Unfortunately, you don't have 2 years on this one, but it's going to have the same potential long-term impact of that decision. So the more conversation you have, absolutely, the only good things can come of that. And at the end of the day, you got to rest on what you decide. You can't go back and, you know, like any decision you guys make as a board, you do the best you can. And sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. And that may sound bad, but that's just life. You can't dwell on it. You make the best decision you can for this community. And, you know, and overall the community sees that in the big scheme of things. You're not going to please everybody. And honestly, it's not your job. Your job is not to please anyone. Your job is to do the best you can for the boys and girls of Rockdale County. The boys and girls this year, the boys and girls next year, the boys and girls 10 years from now, the ones you may never see or serve. You lay the foundation to set the best district you can to serve those kids. And that's exactly why you're here and what you're doing. So good point.
So other questions?
I have a question, and I think you've already said this, but it is a lot of information.
It is a
I'm just
lot.
trying to remember. Did you say we only have one opportunity to opt out,
Yes.
or so we can't pass a resolution 5 years down the road?
No.
Because
Now,
I thought-
here's the trick.
wanted to
There's
confirm
nothing to say you can't ask your local delegate to pass legislation
for
to
our
put in
county.
a floating homestead. So if you opt out of this and then 2 years from now, 3 years from now, you decide, hey, we want to do a 3% cap floating homestead, you can ask your local delegate. Now, keep in mind, y'all don't control them. They are your elected officials that go to Atlanta. They may or may not carry it, but I would find it hard to believe your local legislators would not carry a bill to reduce taxes because that's going to be good for getting reelected. That's just the nature of the beast. But this particular bill, you're in or you're out as of March 1. So you don't have any opportunity. And there's nothing to say the legislature might not come back a year from now and give you an option. There's nothing to say your local delegate doesn't pass a homestead exemption next year for y'all that you can opt out of. That's what happened in Hall. Good example of Hall County. But this particular thing, you've got one opportunity. And that's as of March 1st.
Other questions? Tim, could you, again, I understand why there are not a ton of pros, cons, but the ones that do exist are important. So for our viewing audience, and people will come back and view this later who can't look at it live, pros and cons.
All right. Again, what are the pros of House Bill 581? The pros are it reduces the tax liability for homeowners on their homesteaded property only, not extended properties, only the homesteaded properties. The longer they own that home, the more of a savings they will experience because their home will only grow at the rate of inflation or less. It can't grow any faster no matter what the housing market does around their home. So that is a huge advantage. The disadvantage of that is it reduces the revenue that the school, the city, and the county will collect. That doesn't mean you won't see growth. You're growing, so your digest still may grow 100 million. Under 581, it just may only grow 80 million or some arbitrary number. However, if you don't get the revenue you need to balance your budget, then the cons are you may have to bump the millage, or you may not be able to roll it back. So if you don't roll it back or have to bump it up, then the homeowner is still experiencing a tax break, and it's potentially still a savings for them if you maintain the millage or have to bump it up, especially the longer they own the home. But then your business community, your large landowners, all of them will have to experience the full increase of whatever the millage is. And, worst case scenario, you raise the millage. The hardware store down in Conyers, they don't get a tax break. So their hammer costs more now, and the homeowner might have got a break on his taxes, but then he has to pay more for that hammer. So it's kind of like we're experiencing with inflation. So that's your big pro con. Another con is you have no control over this. This was written by Atlanta. There are things in this bill that are not determined yet. They're not set yet, and they're not controlled in Rockdale County. They're controlled in Atlanta. The state tax commissioner picks the index. You don't control that. That's a con. You can always pass a local homestead and control every part of that, but you can under this. So that's a con for a lot of people, not having the control and not knowing, because you're making a decision not knowing all the details. I'll tell you right now, the stuff I shared with you is our best guess. So that is definitely a con. The trick is what outweighs what? Which the pros outweigh the cons, con outweigh the pros. And it's going to be different for everybody depending on which seat you're in. Yes, ma'am.
So, is it fair to say that, this is really not for the students of Rockdale County? It's really for the taxpayers?
It is 100% for your property, your homeowners.
Okay.
It's 100% for your homeowners. It is a tax cut for your homeowners.
And let me be clear, Tim's not making a partisan statement,
no.
right? So, and I know, and I just want to be clear on that.
Yeah.
He's answering the question truthfully based on how the legislation was crafted and the intent of the legislation.
That is absolutely
to give
right.
the homesteaded property owner a break, a tax break.
Yep, I am definitely not picking a side. If you pull my voter registration card, you will see I check other and write American. I am an American. Hope that doesn't offend anybody, but I am an American. I am not going to be painted into a corner. I will think what I want to think, and that changes depending on the topic. So, yes, sir.
I'm not certain that I saw the final draft of the legislation, but was there a penny sales tax that was incorporated in the final?
Yes, I
legislation?
mentioned that earlier. If the cities and the counties stay in and don't opt out, they can pass a 1 cent local option sales tax. The schools do not have that.
Okay.
That was taking out. Now, I do think that was in some earlier versions because there were some legislators that had told their local delegates or their local communities that they could pass a penny. It was not in the bill. It was in the original bill, but it got pulled out.
For school.
for
school
schools
district.
only. So the city and the county can pass one, but not the schools.
Do we have any idea, and I know this doesn't impact the school system, but I mean, we are one of 3 taxing authorities in the community. So Rockdale County has a host sales tax that we get credit, but it's only for like county M&O. Do you have any idea what impact this legislation has on our current host?
I don't know what it would impact on that. I do know there is, it's not clear currently in statute, you can only pass 2 pennies at a time. It's not clear if this legislation allows you to go to a third or if this is just one of the 2 you can pick, because there's multiple. The county, y'all have the E-Splice. That's all y'all get. But
Right.
the city and county have a couple different they can pick. One you mentioned, T-Splice, this. So it's not clear if the language in the law with the intent was to allow them to take an additional third, going up to a third, or if this is just going to be one of the 2 that they can pass. So I don't think it would have an impact. I don't really know the impact on the one you mentioned, but I do know that there's some controversy about if it's going to be an additional penny or just one of the many they can pass. One of the, I won't say many, but there are more than one they can pass. And this does not replace E-Splice. I had that question. Does not change your E-Splice. It doesn't impact E-Splice. It just, you can't pass a local option sales tax for M&O. So you don't get any option for additional penny,
Unlike our governmental partners.
unlike the city and the county. That's correct. I will say it's interesting for what it's worth. Had an opportunity to train in the county where the legislator that introduced this bill is from. The legislator that introduced this bill recommended to their superintendent they need to opt out.
Wow.
And their business partner is on the board and was in the meeting, and their business partner said that the legislator was very clear that this is not the bill introduced. It got changed a lot in committee before it ever made it to the floor. So for what that's worth, you can take it with a grain of salt. It was told to me, I trust 100% trust the board and the superintendent that told me. I have no reason to doubt that they would lie to me about it, but okay, stranger things have happened. Do find it interesting though. The legislator that introduced it told their local superintendent, you need to opt out. So I just thought it was funny. That's just, you can't make it up. And I don't mean to be, it's just, y'all know, y'all been on the board. The politics are just, God bless. All you can do is laugh at it sometimes. It is what it is.
It's sad.
Other questions? Let me just say, this was a question, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman. I do plan to have at least a couple more informationals. Right. In fact, I'm in communication with Will Barkley. Remember, he had said he would come back. Tried to get him for this Thursday, but he's going to be going home for Thanksgiving. But I've asked him for December 5th, which is our work session for December, and it looks favorable. But yes,
And I just have a comment,
Sure.
which is really not a question. As much as we definitely, want to help the taxpayers, we get mandates for increased health insurance, increased contribution to TRS and other things that are going up higher than the rate of 2-3%, whatever
Oh, absolutely.
the inflation might be, or the CPI, or whatever they're going to use, or whatever is decided. We get mandates that make us, that we don't control in Rockdale County. So, I mean, I can say this, I'm going out. I'm not even going to be here next year, but, it does become a political thing. And there's so much misunderstanding about taxes and how they're calculated. And, oh, well, y'all can do this because y'all are getting all this extra money. But then we also have all these extra things we have to cover that are not our control.
And let's face it, anybody that's dealt, I know Dr. Oates has dealt with it in his tenure as superintendent, but if as a superintendent or anybody that's lobbied for education, it is very clear they all see our fund equities in the state of Georgia. They've been and when I say they, I mean Atlanta, our legislators in Atlanta. They've been very vocal about we need to spend all our fund equity. They don't understand. We had an influx of federal money that we didn't ask for, but we did the smart thing and we built up our rainy day reserves. And heaven forbid we have a rainy day reserve. We might need them. We have pandemics, we have recessions. But that has been told to me by legislators. You need to spend those reserves. You got too much money in reserves. And then when you look at the bills that have been passed, like you mentioned, they do pass a lot of unfunded mandates. And in a lot of their minds, it's because y'all got the money in reserves. They don't understand you could be saving money to build a building. I know in Bainbridge, I had money I was saving to build a middle school. And the good Lord I did, because after the pandemic happened, within 18 months of us hiring our general contractor and putting it out for bid, that $40 million school went to $63 million in 18 months. And had I not had the reserve, we would have never been able to build that school. But since I did have the reserve, we were able to not stall, build the school, not cut things, because again, the building's going to be there for 50 years. So yeah, there's a lot of politics. And at the end of the day, they don't mind y'all raising taxes because it doesn't impact them. It doesn't impact their votes. And I'm not being negative towards we got a lot of politicians up there that do fight for us. But at the end of the day, it doesn't impact when they run for reelection if y'all raise the millage. But it does if they. So, and indirectly, that's what's happening with this bill. And I hope I don't offend anybody, but y'all know I'm just going to be honest. It is, if I offend you, my dearest apologies, but I've just seen it. I know I've dealt with it because I still lobby for them and fight for the schools every day in my position. So
just to our board, I'm working with Joyce, of course. She can work with Will to get numbers to populate what Tim shared. And I know that Joyce, you also had shared with our board what the loss would have been over the previous 6 years. What did you share? Oh, okay. Gotcha.
use the digest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So we're going to get that information so that we can actually come back and show you the chart with our information, Joyce. So if you make a note of that,
and
get
feel
with
free
Will.
to email me if you want me to double check numbers and look. Not that I'll know exactly because they're only as good as you get. But I've looked at enough communities, that ratio, kind of get a good idea if it may be in the ballpark. So feel free to let me know if there's anything I can do with you.
All right.
What scares me the most is I'm always looking at projections out, and that's the unknown that I put a circle around. And I think all of us want, when we leave the board, we left it in a better shape than when we started. But then when we think about those numbers and how it's impacting our students, and then still trying to be the community partner with our, local community with these taxes, it makes it difficult.
Absolutely.
So I'm looking forward to those numbers because I think it's gonna make a big difference. I'm gonna be honest, I'm torn. But it is, thank you for the presentation. The information did help.
You are not alone. There's a lot of other board members across the state that are feeling just the same as you. So any other questions for me? Did everybody sign the sign-in sheet for the
Yes.
hour?
They did, and I've shared that with, yes, absolutely.
It's not a question for you, but it's just a comment to the board. We have to remember that we have a new board coming in on January 1. So when we have these information sessions, the new individual coming in, we have to send invites to him so he gets this information as well.
And we did in this instance, but I think he had a conflict with another training, but which is in part why I decided to direct that this is recorded. So you'll be able to look at the video, and then he can come in and we'll share all information. I am sharing all the information with Larry.
Are there any other questions? Do I hear a motion to conclude the meeting?
Second, Akita.
Motion to conclude the meeting has been made by Ms. Jones and second by Ms. Palmer. All in favor? Motion carries. 5:10, 6:10, is it